We're live. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Matthew Skinner here with us in this afternoon on our first week on education, human rights, sexual diversity, and gender. Dr. Matthew Skinner is a psychologist in the United States of America. He's professor Roosevelt University, assistant professor of Department of Psychology, affiliated faculty Women and Gender Studies Department, is fellow in American Psychological Association Division for Fellow Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, and Fellow in Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. So his lecture will be about turning the tide, conversion therapy, LGBTQ plus rights, and queer resistance. I said before, Dr. Matthew Skinta, please make yourself at home, so be comfortable.
Thank you so much. Um, so I do understand this will be a more interdisciplinary audience. So please bear with me as I speak from my perspective as a psychologist, which has certainly shaped both how I approach this work and think about it, as well as what I'll share with you here today. I realized just before that I'd written a reference to entering the field of psychology, but that's not all of us here. But I want you to consider that all of us entered the fields we work in, at least if you're motivated to attend a conference with human rights in the title, hoping to alleviate some aspect of human suffering. Every human has a gender identity, a sexual orientation. It's our societal responses to that diversity that can be a major cause of suffering. And we've not moved quickly enough to train therapists to provide support, to counter social bias. And I think that even for non psychologists, it's incredibly important to pay attention to the intersection because often the ways in which mental health professionals discuss or describe or talk about challenges faced by LGBTQ people trickles into the public. And so, if in a given country or region or profession under the mental health umbrella, there's pathologization of LGBTQ people, that's something that's going to lead to that's going to lead to the promotion of bias. And so, where is it safe to be LGBTQ? I think it's helpful to start here because oftentimes when I give these talks over the years, I'll have people say to me, well, but this was, uh, this is something that's changed. It doesn't really work the same anymore. Um, well, Spain has often taken the top spot in social attitude surveys as the most LGBTQ plus friendly place over the past decade or so. So, beginning in 2013 with the Pew Research Center's rankings, other rankings may place it as low as 6, but there's broad agreement that it's near the top of the list. And yet, 4 out of 10 Spanish people report harassment in the past year. 1 in 3 report avoiding areas of their city for fear of harassment or violence. There was a 24-year-old nursing student, Samuel Luis, who was beaten to death outside of a gay club on July 3rd in 2021, just having a FaceTime conversation on his phone when a group of men walking by accused him of trying to film them. Hate crimes had risen in the first half of 2021 in every major city across Spain. This is the safest option, maybe, or one of the safest options in the world. And so, how does that compare when you think about your local environment? How is Brazil? So, on the one hand, on paper, some things don't look so bad. Marriage equality occurred in 2011. But despite this, actually, I should update this. I think it's almost 2 weeks ago now. But there have been recent efforts in Brazil to overturn marriage equality. And though my Brazilian colleagues tell me that this is unlikely to pass, it is still worth considering that just the fact that politicians are trying to do so and the stress that this creates for queer and trans young people seeing this sort of animosity toward them in the world. Anti-LGBTQ rhetoric seems to have increased among far-right politicians. 20% of Brazilians in recent surveys suggest that or agree with the idea that homosexuality is a disease, and 40% believe that some sort of healing is possible, that people should be able to stop being gay or lesbian or bisexual or queer if they attended therapy. More queer and trans people are murdered in Brazil than anywhere else in the world. It's been the first place for murders for the past 14 years. And almost half of queer and trans Brazilians report verbal harassment. And half of that harassment is in public. It's walking down the street, it's in restaurants, it's places where others are witnessing. This is an important piece I'll get to later when I talk about some of my research findings related to social safety. And we know that psychological science also creates a lack of safety. I opened with this idea that psychology is acted and psychiatry is acted in many ways as a steward for information around sexuality and gender, and has shaped how it's viewed in the world, but our impact has been pretty mixed. Ever since Magnus Hirschfeld over a century ago had popularized the words homosexual and transsexual, which he used to refer to identities we'd probably now label transgender. Psychology and psychiatry have had central roles in differentiating these domains and deciding what counts and what doesn't. These have not always been in ways that are to the benefit of or in the service of the needs of queer and trans people. So this has included pathologizing views about origins or etiologies of sexual orientation diversity, and diagnostic labels like gender dysphoria that are used frequently in the US and continue to pathologize trans identities while not accurately describing the experiences of all trans people. We see a lot of, until a very sort of short minute ago, we see a lot of bias up through the 1980s in publications on therapy, back when it was trendier and more popular to believe that therapy could alter sexual orientation. And I focus here on behavioral therapies because my understanding is that in Brazil, it is cognitive behavioral therapists who are some of the primary perpetrators of claiming that they can change sexual orientation with therapy. One of the problems in all of this research is this differentiation between actions and actors. So a lot of the early research just talks about homosexual behavior, but it's often even clear that the person who's being treated has bisexual, romantic, and sexual history, experiences with women and men, and it's hard to know what exactly is being treated. They're centered by heterocentrism, this idea or this false assumption that there's something particularly natural or normal about heterosexuality. There's a still leading CBT researcher in the US, David Barlow, who in a model he published through the 70s and 80s, just referred to every form of arousal that wasn't heterosexual as deviant arousal, meaning that you cluster pedophilia and homosexuality and different fetishes all just in one category, as something that's drifting from this assumed natural state of heterosexuality. And the emphasis on gender deviation also conflates transgender and sexual minorities, minoritized identities. It's very difficult looking at some of these older studies to know, is this someone who would grow up and identify as trans, as gay, as lesbian, as both? These are overlapping communities. Context didn't matter when we look at this old science. So, for example, there was a process referred to as covert sensitization, um, where a novel stimuli to that at most was applying a novel stimuli to a habituated fear. So individuals would sit with a therapist across the room from them and begin to imagine uh, terrible things occurring, for example, while engaging in same-sex sexual behavior. And none of the researchers mentioned the fact that you have an older anti-gay therapist sitting right in front of them, talking them through this. How much of those therapy effects, those short-lived, brief therapy effects, were just from being in the presence of someone who was treating you in a homophobic manner? And change was heavily overstated. The literature is a bit of a mess, but there's reason to believe that less than 5% of individuals in any study at any of these points in times experienced lasting perceptions of sexual orientation change due to psychotherapy, maybe even less. So, how did researchers even find these cases? How was the data skewed? We know even from more recent studies that often attempts to find evidence that therapy can alter sexual orientation requires very selective fishing and recruitment of participants who um, are employed by sexual orientation change focused organizations or members of very conservative communities. I cite below, they're both on Twitter, now X, Craig Rodriguez Seijas and Lorenzo Loacas have both written commentaries about some of this literature last summer in 2022 when it had really come to the fore in some CBT organizations in the US. They're both worth looking up for their phenomenal commentaries in this area. And so what about coming to therapy? So we know that psychological science hasn't always been trustworthy. What do we see when we look at what's actually happening? Um, well, on the one hand, there's been some evidence floating around across a few studies for decades. This is just one that I picked, the Grella article, suggesting that queer and trans people use therapy more, even in the absence of a diagnosable disorder. So they may not be meeting criteria for depression or for general anxiety disorder, but are still seeking treatment. My assumption would be because we know that there are so many interpersonal costs, family or parental rejection, that can make life hard as a queer or trans person. Um, there was a study conducted at the Center for Social Connection at the University of Washington a few years ago, suggesting that regardless of diagnostic category, about 2/3 of the people that seek treatment by a therapist do so because of either loneliness or feeling that meaningful relationships have been ruptured or are deteriorating. So that probably explains the difference. Queer and trans people are much more vulnerable to isolation or disconnection from families of origin. But this doesn't mean this greater likelihood that a therapist is seeing queer and trans clients. It does not mean that they're receiving better therapy. It doesn't mean that therapists have received any particular treatment. Tanya Israel has conducted a handful of studies really emphasizing the ways that queer and trans people experience their therapists as either overemphasizing or emphasizing, sort of avoiding and uninformed about sexual orientation or gender identity. The Trevor Project, based in the US, a hotline for queer and trans youth who are struggling with isolation, loneliness, or suicidality, found that 5% of youth that have used their services reported exposure to sexual orientation or gender identity change efforts, or so-called conversion therapy. 42% of those exposed to these treatments attempted suicide versus 17% of other youth. So there are some signs. There are a number of studies, and this is also still hotly contested by some researchers what exactly the number is but there are a number of points of data that should at least raise serious concerns that exposure to these therapies may be harmful to youth. Many queer and trans people experience some sort of conversion therapy. A recent systematic review noted a median across studies of 13% of queer and trans people in the US had experience with these therapies. Rates appeared even higher among trans women, among people of color. And research by Elon Meyer, David Frost, and their colleagues suggests that even though queer and trans people have started coming out younger in recent decades, and even though there have been substantial changes in many parts of the world in terms of legal rights and the law, these changes have had minimal impact on exposures to violence, bias, or discrimination, meaning that psychological distress still remains quite high among younger people. There's also, I think when I uploaded to Google here, it affected some of the formatting, so my apology for these jumped lines. There's also some phenomenal research, a series of publications really, by Craig Rodriguez Sejas now, suggesting that both sexual and, as of a few weeks ago in his recent publication, sexual or gender minoritized people are being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder at much higher rates than cisgender heterosexual people. This difference occurs when you control for variables that correlate with borderline personality disorder, including maladaptive personality. Essentially, just the process of sitting in the chair across from a therapist and declaring yourself to be trans or declaring yourself to be bisexual or pansexual vastly increase the odds that you're going to be misdiagnosed with a personality disorder. And clinicians are partial to this diagnosis, regardless of the presentation in front of them. This really emphasizes the way that societal assumptions of psychopathology among queer and among cisgender and heterosexual clinicians leads to the mistreatment of queer and trans people seeking services. And we're also in the midst of sort of a global moral panic. Russia signed an LGBT anti-propaganda law in 2013 in the context of speech suggesting that LGBT images in media were somehow harmful to children, that children shouldn't even be exposed or see them. This was mirrored in Hungary just a couple of years ago. Such laws have been debated in parts of the US. And these laws have been lobbied for across Eastern Europe by evangelical organizations based in the US, foreign NGOs that are using their influence and their cash to encourage this sort of discrimination. These laws ignore the existence of LGBT children who are harmed or isolated as a result. There's often this talk of the importance of protecting children, but the implication is that somehow all children are heterosexual and cisgender and would be unless harmed in some way, which is false, a false belief that leads to a great deal of aggression, persecution, and discrimination toward queer and trans people. And governments and politicians across the globe have increasingly used terms like LGBT ideology or gender ideology to make these claims that they're opposing a certain belief or a certain way of thinking about the world, and to mask the fact that their actions are intended to harm individuals, to harm families, and to harm communities. Many scholars, sociologists, political scientists have emphasized how hollow this sort of rhetoric is, that gender ideology doesn't necessarily mean anything when a politician uses it. At its heart, it's ultimately, typically, just about the claim that any degree to which we differentiate between biological sex and the cultural and social roles by gender that people have attributed to them is going to harm society in some way. We also see how the misapplication of science or harmful science echoes around the world, and corrections don't so much. So when Littman proposed this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, the idea that adolescents who are exposed um, to peers, to online groups that promote identifying as trans, um, and are experiencing other types of life difficulties, that this may lead to claiming or identifying with a trans identity. But the term rapid onset gender dysphoria was created by Littman to recruit for this survey. And despite early media coverage in 2018 suggesting that her data was based on the experiences of LGBTQ young people, when you sought out the article, and there were corrections and retractions required by the journal, when you sought out the article, it immediately became clear that this was just a survey of conservative parents and their stereotypes about why their children might identify as trans. This is an important distinction, because if we were to have, it's one thing if we were to have evidence that this is something children experience, but if this is just a stereotype of conservative adults, does it really matter? Especially when we think about how we approach and treat and create safe environments for children. There have been a number of studies since that suggest that it is not so rapid, not so real a phenomena, that when you actually look at adolescents, when you actually look at children who are seeking gender affirming services, this doesn't appear to be associated with psychological distress. There's no clear pattern or predictability of whether or not they have trans friends, of whether or not those friends are online or in person. The American Psychological Association, alongside a number of other professional associations, has signed a brief detailing the actual science around trans identification among young people, and the lack of evidence that there's any such thing as rapid onset gender dysphoria. But unlike the original article, there was no echo around the globe of this statement. As I give talks, I was in Sao Paulo 2 weeks ago. I was in Hungary this past summer. I was in Romania before that. As I do this work around the globe, I am routinely met with caring professionals who have been exposed to the message that these are real phenomena and have not been exposed to the message or had access to information that these claims have been disproven or are not the case. And I've touched a few times on this idea of conversion therapy, or the American Psychological Association prefers the terms sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts to emphasize the fact that these are not true therapies. Every year since marriage equality became the law in the United States, cities like Budapest have hosted large, well-attended conferences with speakers from groups like the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. That might be a name that sounds respectable and sounds like a good organization. It is the rebranding of an organization previously known as NARTH, or the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. So this is a group that promotes and advocates for conversion therapy. And these groups, these trainings, a significant amount of money is thrown at them and supports them from conservative groups in the US, and then disseminates them globally, despite claims that gay and trans rights or George Soros are behind some sort of international agenda to deconstruct the family, or other popular global myths right now. The reality is that there is substantial money behind the proselytization and promotion of ideas that there is a core psychopathology underlying gender identity and sexual orientation diversity, and that this requires treatment. Current leaders of these groups or advocates of these approaches tend to emphasize these days two key areas of psychological research that are very poorly supported. One is the claim that the idea that minority stress, which I'll talk about soon, but minority stress is the leading theory at the moment of how the broad range of bias that queer and trans people are exposed to can lead to psychological distress. Um, so current advocates say, well, maybe this is better accounted for by neuroticism among gay men or other forms of underlying psychopathology. Maybe it's not about bias. Um, there's Mike Bailey at Northwestern here in Chicago had written a piece in 2020 that essentially argues that given the number of feminine characteristics of some gay men, that there was a neurotic or histrionic style associated with women that we saw manifesting in gay men, and maybe that was really the cause of distress. Evidence for the idea that there's nothing wrong with society, only inside of LGBTQ people. And then Lisa Diamond, really leading scientist on sexual orientation diversity, had written about a model a number of years ago and has conducted a number of studies on the idea of sexual fluidity, the idea that in certain contexts and certain times in our lives that we may experience attraction or engage in sexual or romantic relationships that don't correspond to our default sexual orientation. And so these groups have also claimed, well, if it's possible through the course of the lifespan that some people have these experiences, surely we could promote that in psychotherapy. But these arguments ignore the fact that minority stress appears to be a better predictor of LGBT distress, even when you factor in neuroticism. And there's nothing in the fluidity data that suggests it could be forced, manipulated, or even that it's an experience of every person to the same degree, or that every individual has the same capacity for fluidity. And so I'd mentioned minority stress theory, and I think it's worth highlighting, particularly for those of you outside of psychology, as this is such a dominant frame right now. So minority stress theory says that when you consider the broad range of mechanisms of how societal stigma can trickle into our lives, you have to look at a range of factors from the most internal to the most external, the actions of others. This was originally developed by Virginia Brooks in a book titled Minority Stress in Lesbian Women. Her experiences as a Black queer woman, as a social worker, led to, in her doctoral work, exploring these relationships. And this book came out in the early 1980s and sat on a shelf for many years. Elon Meyer is most associated with popularizing the theories. He began to explore ways in the diverse communities of New York of testing these hypotheses. And so he looked at a range of factors. Self-stigma, so what's our degree of internalized homophobia, internalized biphobia, or transphobia? And then what about external sources of stigma, anticipated stigma, or expectations of rejection? Sometimes you'll see this described as rejection sensitivity. But these all get to the same factor, which is regardless of how I feel about myself, what is my belief about how other people might view me based on my gender or sexual orientation? And to what extent does that put pressure on me to guard myself or conceal my experiences so that I can remain safe moving among others? This is followed by outness, although most researchers have noticed that in wealthy nations, it's increasingly the norm that everyone is out, even with conservative families or conservative political geographies. And so there's a greater emphasis these days on concealment of one's sexual orientation or gender identity. How much effort do you feel you need to put in so that other people do not notice, spot, or label your identity in a way that could lead to harm? And then finally, discrimination or violence, the overt negative or hostile acts of other people. And since at least the late, or since at least about 15 years ago, Elon Meyer and his work, and then other researchers in minority stress, have begun to pay attention to resilience factors as well, such as community connectedness. Now, you might ask yourself, is this community connectedness like broadly in my community? Is this community connectedness within LGBTQ communities? The answer is yes. When you look at um, uh, more socially engaged or collective cultures, there have been some studies like Fakama and Cooper's work um, looking at social networks that involve things like volunteerism and voting in the Netherlands that would lead us to believe that feeling like you belong in your town or your village is an important aspect of this type of resilience. Though there's also work that's been done in the US that looks specific to LGBT types of community building and would say that's also important. So all of the ways, and I'll touch more on this in a moment, but all of the ways that really give us a sense that we have social belonging appear to be important. And these are then in turn related to a broad range of psychological symptoms. And this kind of led to the next big puzzle for LGBT researchers saying, well, we had models for trauma, for example, if someone had experienced discrimination. But you don't just see trauma when you look at LGBTQ people, right? You see depression, you see substance use, you see panic disorders. And Mark Hotzenbuehler has conducted a series of studies since that argue that it's actually emotion regulation that is attacked. It's our ability to feel and to sit with strong negative emotions that gets chipped away at every time we're exposed to these sources of bias. And then whether that turns into a vulnerability to depression or to substance use is really shaped by the community culture that we're a part of. Now, that early research was all focused primarily on lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual people. And so Michael Hendricks and Rai Testa decided to look at the idea of, do we really see the same thing when we look at trans and gender nonconforming people? And there are a number of reasons why it might look different, not the least of which is the fact that rates of violence or physical and sexual abuse or rejection are all much higher among when looking at the experiences of transgender or gender diverse people. Acts of violence were infrequently reported to the police, but there's data suggesting that that when trans people do attempt to report mistreatment to the police, that they are then in turn abused by the police. And so what they found, Hendricks and Testa, was that it more or less mapped on, but I have this image color-coded a little. So the blue factors are the ones that seem to relate to everyone. The more lavender are the gender-specific ones. So gender dysphoria. How do you experience distress? Remember, not all trans people do, but some trans people may experience distress with a mismatch between the experience of embodiment they have and their internal gender identity. Are they misgendered by others? And then pride arose as a resilience factor in their work. I also use dotted lines for those factors that have appeared increasingly in the literature, but aren't always labeled as a part of the minority stress model. So for example, Pasgalupo and colleagues have highlighted the role of gender dysphoria as adding above and beyond these other factors when looking at stressors that trans and non-binary people experience. Self-compassion, when you look at like Jay Puckett's work, has been highlighted again and again as a variable that may offer important sources of resilience. And so you have these stressors filtered through these sources of resilience, all sort of boiling out in our emotion regulation skills that tells us whether we're having adverse outcomes or not. And how well does this work? Well, there have been a couple attempts to develop therapies based on either targeting emotion regulation or trying to find space for the whole model. There's the ESTEEM protocol developed by John Pachankis and his colleagues, that has been demonstrated with gay, bi, and queer identified men and women and received support. Though the findings are a bit more mixed when compared against an active control. Um, there's some data to suggest that that there may be a greater impact when looking at Black and Latina sexual minority men. Um, there's also been some data suggesting that perhaps the greater minority stress or minority stressors that a person's exposed to, the more important these therapies may be. But it also may be that we have more to explore and additional approaches to develop to continue to improve meeting the needs of queer and trans people. Time will tell. But I also think it's important to come back to this idea I mentioned earlier of safety in the world. So for many queer and trans people, family rejection, poor job protections, these are a reality. We know that rejection sensitivity, that expectation of mistreatment from others is deeply influenced by parental rejection. Marcela Matos and Sergio Carvalho had conducted a study showing that when you looked at gay versus straight men with chronic experiences of depression that are high in trait shame, that the types of shame that are experienced are very different between gay and straight men. That maybe there are stressors related to a lack of safety in the world where even when we're looking at a common diagnosis like depression, the sources are different. We also know that there are a lot of sources of prejudice within queer and trans spaces. You don't get to escape to a city and then be completely safe. That there's racism within queer and trans circles. There are mathematical models like the one cited, suggesting that due to sexual racism, the exclusion of Black men from sexual networks, that leads to predictable increases in rates of exposure to HIV that affect those minoritized men. We know that there are a number of different ways that trans people are excluded in the world. And so Lisa Diamond, I'd mentioned earlier, says all of these labels aside, we're really talking about a few really basic core experiences. And what it comes down to is about an embodied sense of safety around others, a felt sense of worth or belonging, and an experience of our very self that is safe, that we might feel lovable. This underlying factor that holds all of these variables could be described as social safeness. Am I still someone that feels at ease? Does my body feel co-regulated and like it's at ease the moment that another social being enters the room? Or is that undermined because of the history and the learning experiences I've had about threat received from others? And so we might boil that whole model down into this, that the sources of distress are really about contexts that punish or evoke histories related to our vulnerable and authentic expressions of sexuality and gender. That our sources of resilience are really about the extent to which we're in contact with histories where our authenticity and vulnerability has been reinforced, that we've experienced safety. And then what are the current behaviors that we've developed in response to this? It's important to consider not just variables that drive minority stress, but also the fact that there's a unique cultural context experienced by queer and trans people. That unique culture that's evolved in cities around the globe, some of it global, some of it local, the tools we've developed for moving through the world. So these are important factors to consider. And I wanted to end on a study that I'd conducted a couple years ago in Poland. And I'm working to finish writing up to publish related to experiences of resistance among queer and trans people in Poland. This is hostile graffiti in the image painted outside the window of an apartment that that LGBT people lived in. So this work was inspired by Glenda Russell's work on exploring how the stress of political debates about the lives and rights and belonging of queer people affects individual well-being. In her early work, this led to the identification of 6 factors that appeared to generally protect against harm. And these involved cultivating a movement perspective. So remembering that you're part of this march toward rights that involves other people, that you're not alone in, that involves other movements, that it involves action-oriented coping, doing something. Paying attention to your allies, or what in some of her work she calls, and I love this label, successful witnessing. Can you notice and orient toward those cisgender heterosexual people that are speaking up against people that would harm queer and trans communities? Can you watch for negative messages? Do you find and make use of your queer and trans and allied communities? And then finally, doing all the usual things that help people, caring for our bodies, getting enough sleep, exercise. So with my Polish colleagues, we developed a pool of items to try and test out these topics and see. So I was there the second half of 2021, which is when there was a lot of anti-LGBT rhetoric and debate and anti-LGBT laws that were being proposed. This survey included 253 participants that on average were quite young. It was cross-sectional, meaning we were just looking at this snapshot across these variables where we looked at daily discrimination, experiential avoidance, psychological difficulties, and queer resistance. I've kind of glossed over it a little, but there's a debate in some of the literature about the idea of could we or should we adopt the word resistance as opposed to resilience? Resilience sounds so passive. Resilience says you lived through it. But so often the behaviors we're talking about, the behaviors I just listed from Glenda Russell's work, are active. They require us to take meaningful, chosen steps to exert our agency. So is it better that we think of these as resistance? And so in terms of sexual orientation, about 65%, about 2/3 of our sample were bisexual or pansexual. The next largest group, gay or lesbian. We had, again, about 2/3 that were cisgender, followed by non-binary, and then other gender groups. And what we found is that when we looked at the daily exposure to cis heterosexism, really, and how it predicted that anticipation of stigma among others, experiential avoidance, or the desire to not be in contact with unwanted experiences, we found that queer resistance really interrupted this pathway between the daily discrimination individuals were facing and avoidance of settings where it might occur, which is important, right? This says that there's a tendency to stop engaging in a life in the ways that are meaningful, to doing the things that matter to us, but that when we're engaged in active forms of resistance, that we can continue doing those things even in the face of daily discrimination. All of this leads us back to a question, and I was encouraged to leave 20 minutes for discussion, but we'll have about 15, so apologize for taking the time. This whole line of work begs the question on whether or not it's our job or our duty. Are you a social scientist, a clinician, an attorney? How are you incorporating studies or attempting to change social attitudes that result in harm or the disenfranchisement of other people? As a valued direction, an intrinsically reinforcing pattern of behaviors, as we call it in psychology, but a valued direction, There's no objective answer to this question. I can't decide for you if it's your duty to try and implement change. I share with my students my belief that when social attitudes change in a manner that results in harm, and those harms are measured and observed in our clinical work, we do have a specific platform and role in attempting to remedy those sources of distress. And so I'd encourage you, perhaps in your own roles, to think about that. And I do want to end on the idea, I talk so much about suffering, but queer and trans people aren't only suffering in the world. Queer and trans people are also finding moments to dance at clubs, to find romance, to dress to fit their gender, no matter where they're going. Individuals from Poland, Russia, other countries that don't recognize their relationships will fly to countries like Denmark that don't require citizenship for it and get a marriage license so that they could solemnize and recognize their relationship. People engage in activism, march in the streets, volunteer, raise children, organize holidays with friends, kiss and hold hands in public, sometimes if safe enough, sometimes if not. Queer activists, psychologists from all over Central and Eastern Europe that I interviewed for another study I did describe going to places like Berlin to feel free. And then in my own university, we have queer and trans psychologists to be that study every year. So the image is not bleak, and we're not hopeless. And there are places to move and to work and to find a life in these moments. I often think of the words of an old friend of mine in Hungary, who was explaining to me once, as we were talking years back now about some of the anti-LGBT bias that was beginning. He said that he has often seen those documentaries where you have much, much older LGBT people talking about times under Soviet occupation, talking about arrests, and describing how much better things are now, how much they love how things are now. And what he said that stuck with me many years ago was, Matthew, I have one life. I don't want to be another 90-year-old who says it's so lovely that things are different now. I want to enjoy my life, all of my life, as best as I can and as authentically as I can. And so that's the challenge. What are we all doing? What are you doing today toward creating a world where queer and trans people can live all of their life today as authentically and vulnerably as possible? So thank you very much. And let's see, I'm not sure if there's a way for me to view questions. Oh, I just switched over to comments, so now I can see what people have been typing.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Matthew. Your exposure was great, great. I learned a lot of things through your lecture here this afternoon, and I hope everyone is here also learn a lot. I want to thank you, the name of the organization committee, me and Jonathan, having you here. It's really it's a pleasure. It's a great pleasure. So we're now going to questions moment. I have my questions, and there are people here in the comments asking questions too. So I will read some uh, things said by Jay. First, Jay said, understanding yourself as queer in Brazil at young age and in a family that you can't just get away helps you see a lot more how the people in Brazil are really stuck in a fake idea of religious society. Jay said that because here in Brazil, most people are considered Catholic.
Mhm.
So, but people aren't really Catholic. They say they are Catholic, but they don't go to the church. They don't practice Catholicism. So the people are is really stuck in this fake idea. Uh,
I would.
and the question, oh, please.
Oh, I was just going to say I would really also recommend a great book by the French journalist Frederic Martel. Um, in the English title was "In the Closet of the Vatican." I think the title in most other European languages, including Portuguese, was Sodoma, but it's about the tensions and politicization within the Catholic Church
Yeah.
of sexual orientation. It's a very fascinating read and helped me understand quite a bit better about sort of how the Catholic Church leverages politicization um, and where and when they choose to do so.
Oh, thanks. And Jay asked something. I will read it.
Mhm.
As the impact of suppressing religious families endanger most of the kids and even adults who are queer, there is any orientation of how to help in these situations, being a professional that can't simply change a person or kid from their surroundings so they get a better living experience instead of hating themselves.
Mhm. It's a phenomenal question. There's an approach to therapy developed by Gary Diamond at the University of Haifa that emphasizes family reconciliation. And so he has published studies with both adolescents as well as adults who have had ruptures with their parents, primarily around religion in his research, or attributing biased religious values, where he has helped parents and their children um, sort of slow down and find ways for the parents to connect with or better understand how they're harming their children, and for rebuilding the relationship. And this is really important work because there appears to be such a cascade of challenges, such a cascade of barriers and ruptures in meaningful relationships that can harm queer and trans people throughout the rest of their lives when their parents are so rejecting or their families are so rejecting. And so being able to repair that relationship seems to similarly ripple through their lives. So I would love to see more work like that. To my knowledge, that's one of the only therapeutic approaches that is specifically tailored to a very unique aspect of queer and trans life experiences, which is that we are really the only minoritized group where where not only do we differ from our parents um, in most cases, but where it becomes the basis of bias from our parents.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew. Uh, the next question is mine. I will ask is specifically about gender role. Gender role, I think, is one of the biggest problem nowadays. The traditional family, as we speak here in Brazil, all the time replicate this gender role. So men have to do this, women have to do this, and this can change. So it's a challenge we have, and is a problem specifically when you talk about children that consider themselves as queer or transsexual. Here in Brazil, specifically, we have fewer studies about this. Me and Jonathan are researching about children that consider themselves as transgender specifically. It's it's a challenge. We participate in an event recently about children, and our production was the only one talking about this. In a whole event treating about children, we are very courageous to treat about this. So how we can beat this gender role specifically when it treats about children, because when the children enter the school, the children is all the time receiving gender roles. So boys
Mhm.
take this car, girls this Barbie here. So how can we deal with it? How we can demystify that people don't necessarily have boy don't have necessarily take car and the girls Barbie. What are your perspectives about this subject?
Yeah, this is a tough one because it requires a lot of individuals and a lot of systems to be um, more flexible. I mean, in the US, it was really just a couple decades ago that you stopped seeing the same sort of pathologization of, say, boys playing with girls' toys, that sort of thing, um, and which still exists among many people in the US and in many families. So a lot of it might have to do with education of people who are working with children. How do we start creating a space for and paying attention to how we teach about gender roles to childhood educators? Um, what messages we're putting out socially? We know that when we look at rates of discrimination and violence, it doesn't really matter if someone identifies as trans or non-binary or just as gay or lesbian or bi. Across the board, our data for many, many years has suggested that it's a gender role violation that leads to violence, that fuels anti-LGBT attitudes. And so I think we need to just continue having the discussions as a culture of who is harmed by holding such rigid gender roles. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think there's a good or a short answer for that. Um, this is a way where unless we as societies move further away from the idea that you have to have a rigid binary, then there's not room for queer trans people who never really fit the binary in all the ways that they're supposed to.
Thanks, Doctor. The next question is how the subject, specifically about queer and transgender people, is treated in the U.S. schools, because here in Brazil it's very complicated.
Mhm.
Teachers tries to expose this for children, for teenagers to learn about this and to respect. But unfortunately, teachers are receiving in their homes notifications about uh, process. So someone enter with a judicial process, an action,
Mhm.
in the justice, uh, telling that this is destroying the traditional family. So
Yeah.
it's very complicated here in Brazil to deal with this in the schools. We are trying to go inside the schools and talk about it. It's officially, because officially we can, because of all this bias in the one law about national education, the term sexuality and gender was taken out of the project. So
Mhm.
it's complicated. We can't treat about this directly in the schools here. So I would like to know the American experience with this subject.
Yeah, it's a good question. The US has probably extremes you could find in either direction. So, for example, in very progressive areas like California or New York or Massachusetts, you might find teachers' protocols, curricula that are very inclusive. Um, a couple states even now have curricula that are part of the official state curricula that weave in knowledge of historical figures who are LGBT. And then on the other end, we have countries or we have states like Florida, like Texas, where Florida was in the news a lot of the time this past year for a law that was being summarized or described by the media as the "Don't Say Gay" law, because the idea was that it would prohibit teachers from talking about anything related to gender identity or to sexual orientation to younger children. In the original law, it was focused on elementary school, although, as most of us expected, the moment it passed, then there started to be revisions and additions to the law to continue to push the age up at which it would ban any of those discussions, with the goal of having it something that all the way through graduating high school would no longer be legal to discuss. So we have both extremes existing at different parts of the US right now. And because our legal system, our constitution, does not officially designate or have a protection or a guarantee of certain types of education, that means that there's not any federal solution that will say what will have to happen here.
Mhm. Thanks, Dr. Matthews. Let me see. I think I have one more question. 1 minute. It's about how you deal with people who expect rejection and try to reconcile their internal experience with the world around them, because these people don't have this feeling of integrating the LGBTQ plus community, and they try this conversion therapy. So how you deal with these people? How we can help these people to feel part of the community and to be proud of being who they really are.
Yeah, I think that so the main approach I've been emphasizing in my work and that I'm exploring with research and hoping to get some future funding for is really coming back to that idea of social safety. Now, the problem is not, um, we don't want someone to assume that everyone in every setting is safe, because that's not true. The problem, the thing that gets unworkable, is if you carry deep down a belief that no one and nowhere is safe, that's what leads to misery and leads to difficulty in relationships. So what we want to do, and what, like, I used to run a training clinic for LGBT work, and what I would teach my clinicians to do is that we really want to emphasize on finding safety and exploring where we can, taking challenges or taking risks within those meaningful relationships. So if a relationship feels close and connected, could you push yourself to say the thing that you don't usually say in that relationship, to see if you could have an experience of deeper vulnerability? Could you share the parts of yourself that you're afraid will be rejected in meaningful relationships, so that you can see that you're not rejected after? Is this a perfect system? No. But the goal of engaging in these exercises, of taking risks, of practicing safety again and again, is that we can begin to have those vulnerable and authentic relationships, or enough of them, to be ourselves and to live a healthy life. Um, there's an approach to therapy called compassion focused therapy, where so much of the early stage is just imagining someone completely loving of yourself and just practicing that idea of allowing yourself to really feel. the affection coming in again and again, and recognizing how hard it is to do that in a trusting way. So these are some of the ways that I might work with those clinically.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Matthew. We don't have any more questions here on the chat, but Jay, thank you for the answers. I thank you too for the answers. It were very illuminated me. So thank you again. I'm sorry that I'm speaking English here. I'm trying to do my best,
I
but
appreciate it.
I think you're understanding everything, and we're here understanding too. So before we end your presentation, I would like to give you an opportunity this time for present your final considerations and stay my gratitude here, Jonathan's too. So stay comfortable.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this opportunity to be here and speak, and for all of you who have joined.
So, people were ending this lecture, this presentation of Dr. Matthew. I wish to all of you an excellent afternoon, and I specifically wait you on our next lecture. So one more time, Dr. Murphy, thank you. Me and Jonathan are on your disposal. Please uh, enter in touch if you need anything. We are here to contribute, to learn, to with the US experiences as I learned in this afternoon. So this is it. One more time, thank you and have a good afternoon and an excellent week. Bye bye, Dr. Matthew.